Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Donovan Bailey, he made a statement saying that Canada has racism with a smile. But we have people within the fabric of Canadian society that are maybe perhaps greater experts on racism than Donovan Bailey. So, for example, Stockwell Day, the former leader of the Canadian Alliance Party and Conservative MP, he said that, oh, yes, you have a few idiots that are racists hanging around Canada, but it's not systemic. You don't have systemic racism. It's not a systemic problem. And then he compared it to when he was younger and he was bullied for wearing glasses and he was called Four Eyes. And he was obviously victimized. He's still traumatized. I think as a community, we need to stand up and put a GoFundMe page together for him because he was not, he shouldn't have been blamed for having to wear glasses. They didn't even invent LASIK at that time when he was a kid. So what was he supposed to do but wear glasses? And he is so traumatized going through that. Actually, they say that being called Four Eyes is the number 32 reason why people have a bad day in their lifetime. So Stockwell Day, he says that we don't have systemic racism. And there's an article that was written by Rex Murphy in the National Post. So Rex Murphy, 73 years young, wrote a very modern piece, unlike what he's named after, which is one of my favorite dinosaurs. He wrote a very, very modern piece saying, how bad is racism in Canada? And he critiqued some of the statements by the Liberal government, questioning whether or not there was, this prevailing racism or systemic racism. And he touted how much of a welcoming society this was. Okay. And, maybe he should have also made a more significant point to let Indigenous people know that they should have been more grateful to their colonizers. He also denounced in 2017 the removal of Confederate monuments because those were past heroes of the American experiment. And after just less than 2 months after the massacre in Quebec City, he said that maybe there may be something like Islamophobia that exists. Okay. And he's championed people like Israel Levant, and he's previously dismissed white supremacy as something from the progressive fantasy factory. So Rex Murphy, another expert who's lived the reality of racism, asks us a very important question that we should think about, if we're critically thinking. How bad is racism really in Canada? And then you have a statement by Francois Legault, the premier of Quebec, and he says he denies there is no such thing as systemic racism. There's not systemic racism. You have a small number of Quebecers who are racist, but there is no institutionalized racism, right, in Quebec whatsoever. Of course not. Of course there is an institutionalized racism, even though there was that massacre in 2017, right, in Quebec City, the largest, most nefarious massacre on Canadian soil in a place of worship occurred in Quebec, the province of Quebec. And they felt so bad about that massacre and that amount of Islamophobia and the effect that it had on the Muslim community. They actually put policy in place to protect any Muslim woman from being killed on any government institution. With their Bill 21 to prohibit the display of religious symbols, which overwhelmingly targets Muslim women, they ensured that there would be no Muslim women that would be harmed in any type of public institution. So of course he's doing so much, and if we see some of the history of bills that Quebec has introduced, Bill 94, the Quebec Charter of Values, Bill 64, they have been ensuring that something like Islamophobia does not prevail systemically in their society. And what I find interesting is that they always refer to legislation. Listen, there's bills out there, there's laws, and it's supposed to treat everybody fairly, and it's supposed to treat everyone equally. We don't have racism. Where is it that says that black people are treated differently? Where does it say that Muslims are supposed to be treated differently? Where does it say that Indigenous people are supposed to be treated differently? We don't have racism anymore. And many times you're able to hide behind these laws and bills, and you give these laws some really nice names, or these acts like that during the election, where they tried to include that Anti-Barbarism Act. So Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. So of course, we're not targeting minorities or immigrants. We're just trying to stop barbaric cultural practices. And they hide behind these really nice sounding names and bills and say it's fairness. But we know that laws and policies and bills are practiced differentially, and they affect people differentially. It's like, for example, we introduced a bill called the Anti-Cranial Skin Cancer Bill. How can you be for skin cancer? Anti-cranials, but all it does, okay, is that you have to make sure we're against skin cancer. So you have to make sure that no skin on the top of your head is exposed. So if you go into a government building, the only way we're going to give you any type of services is if the skin on your top of your head is not exposed. And guess what? We find out later, hey, this really only affects bald people. This bill, even though it sounds really nice and beautiful, are you for skin cancer? No, I'm not for skin cancer. Or you can't be pro skin cancer. Skin cancer is so bad. So you have somebody who's walking into a building and he says, I need to go get some government services. No, you can't come into the building. You have skin that's exposed on the top of your head. Haven't you heard of the anti-skin cancer bill that was introduced? Cranial skin cancer bill? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. How does me covering my head gonna give you skin cancer? He's like, listen, man, I don't know how a woman wearing hijab infringes on people's freedoms, but it's the law, and I'm just here to enforce it. I'm not here to think, I'm just here to follow it. And that is the type of attitude, and that is the type of posturing that occurs, and that's the type of game that is often played. And so when you try to talk about systemic racism, people have a very short memory. Sometimes they get amnesia. What do you mean? What about the residential schools? What about the 60s scoop? What about the fact that we do have a history of slavery in Canada, and that the first parliament that existed in Canada, many of those members of parliament owned slaves? What about Hogan's Alley, where they displaced black community in Vancouver? What about in Atlantic provinces, where they took away the land and they usurped the land of black landowners? So the Indigenous population has, if you look at the stats systemically, if you look at Muslims, especially in recent years, if we look at the media as an institution, that's a systemic problem. Like, we have Shaykh Yaffa with us here today on the podcast, and only weeks ago we were speaking about the Halifax massacre. Imagine if it was a Muslim who did that, who committed that crime. It would be on the 24-hour news cycle worldwide. Worldwide, it would be continuous. Fox News would open a headquarters in Halifax. They would open a headquarters there, and you would have it broadcast, and we would still be, reminded of it over and over and over again. If we look at the statistics of hate crimes, that doesn't occur in a vacuum. There is a system in place that is proliferating hate crimes against Muslims, that is looking at indigenous people in a certain light, that looks at black people in a certain light. You look at the statistics of how black people are arrested and stopped and frisked more frequently. How indigenous people, you know what I found amazing is that 50%, over 50% of indigenous prison population of women, okay, 50% of them in solitary isolation are indigenous women. That's a you're telling me there's no systemic issue, there's no system in place that is prevailing, but as Donovan Bailey said, it's like racism with a smile. It's a racism. We do have better manners here in Canada, and that's not to reject Canadian society, but to be a strong and resilient society, to be a self-confident society, we need to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and point out our faults. And just by denying and saying, I don't think it exists, you know, we have RCMP heads, deputy commissioner of the RCMP saying it doesn't exist. You know, there's a Muslim brother I know who's in law enforcement, and he said that there is an overwhelming negative attitude amongst most officers against Muslims. There's an overwhelming negative attitude against indigenous people. And then, of course, there's an overwhelming attitude against black people. So the problem ends up being is that you have a narrow definition of what you consider to be racism. So we see somebody being called the N-word and being killed on a short video clip that can be contextualized within a few minutes. That is clear racism, and you cannot come up with any type of alternative explanation. Oh, was there something in his hand? Oh, no, there wasn't something in his hand. Oh, just in case. Just in case. Oh, that could have been the reason why the officer did it. If it's absolutely, you know, it's so clear, there's no room for doubt, and it's contextualized within a few minutes, because remember, our attention spans are very short. We lose attention very, very quickly. It can be contextualized very, very quickly. Then, okay, that's racism. But anything that requires explanation and anything that's hidden, anything that prevails within society or legislation that's written to target a certain group, that's not considered racism. And Malcolm X has a very beautiful quote where he says, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And today I have with us two very dear friends of the program, of the podcast. We've had them on before, and we are here to benefit also from their wisdom and their insight, because they have a real life lived experience of being aware of the issue of racism, understanding the fabric of Canadian society, because we want to focus on the Canadian dynamic, the Canadian paradigm. We're not going to talk about what's happening in the United States. They do have an issue that they're dealing with, especially targeting African Americans, especially targeting the black people. But we're going to talk about the Canadian paradigm, and we're going to talk about their lived experiences. And it won't be as flaky as feeling that I have been traumatized for being called Four Eyes. So with us on the podcast tonight, we have Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick and Shaykh Mohamed Yaffa. I would like to welcome my two dear beloved shaykh on the program today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So I want to get right into it. Do we have, let's start with Dr. Quick. Do we have systemic, does it exist? Is Rex Murphy right? Is the man who's named after my favorite dinosaur correct? Do we not have really that? Racism isn't that bad. And there's a lot of statements now from politicians and so forth. And it seemed to be a specific demographic as well. You know, I don't know if we care to note that. But does systemic racism exist in Canada? What are your thoughts?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah again. This is a very interesting topic, one which needs to be dealt with in a very straightforward, clear way. And as a historian, I tend to step back a little bit to get some perspective. because, you know, we won't fully understand what's happening on the ground today unless we understand something about the past. And when you look at the history of Canada itself, Canada is not like the United States. The United States was a colony of England, and they broke away. They had a revolution, and they broke away, and they based their economy for the most part in the beginning on slavery. And so the very setup within their constitution, they said the African slave is 3/5 of a man. And that struggle went on right from the beginning. But we have to remember that Canada was and still is, to a certain extent, part of the Commonwealth. It was a British colony, and the British had defeated the French. So all throughout the British territories, slavery existed. I mean, Liverpool and the major cities in Britain were built over the backs of African slaves. And what you'll find in the British colonies is based upon their means of production, you'll see a different relationship. So you see in a place like Australia, for instance, you know, they slaughtered the Aborigines. There's no talk about it. They just slaughter and they just throw you in a reservation. But you'll see some of the other colonies, like in Canada, they didn't have large plantations like in the United States. So there was no need for thousands, hundreds and thousands of millions of Africans to work. However, they did inherit the system of the class system and the race system, where Africans were brought in mainly as domestic slaves. So you have domestic slavery. Then you have certain farms too, where the farms were growing. They're not as extensive as the United States, but you did have a farming system where Africans, you know, were also used there. So within Canadian society, right from the beginning, Black people were right on the bottom. I'm not even talking about the First Nation Indigenous people. They were out of the picture. They were considered to be the enemy, the other, and pushed off into reservations. And treaties were made which have never been fulfilled up until today. That's another story in itself, but that's racism too, right? So if we talk about racism, you got to bring up the Indigenous thing. But anti-Black racism existed right from the beginning. But because, for the most part, what we see or what we understand is a domestic type of slavery, where you have your domestic slave in your house, and she's wearing decent clothes and, you know, whatever. It's different than the ball and chain cotton plantation or sugarcane plantation. And so it existed, and right up into the 20th century, Black people held these low positions. We can go further into it as we go along, but, you know, there's another statement which is interesting to talk about Canadian racism. My wife's father, my wife is originally from Jamaica, and she came here at 15 years old. And when her father came from Jamaica, he's a very wise person. And he said that, you know, racism in the United States is rotten and it stinks, it smells. But racism in Canada is rotten, but it has no smell. So that's the same wisdom. It is rotten, it is institutionalized, but because you can't smell it, you don't realize it until your head hits a glass ceiling when you're going up. And there's a ceiling made of glass. You can see through it, but you're going nowhere.
Thank you. Shaykh Yaffa, what are your thoughts? Does systemic racism exist in Canada?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihil kareem Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I think the two of you have given a beautiful framework of exactly what exists. And I like the analogies that you gave, Dr. Syed, of the speeches that we're hearing from people who are comparing things that are, I wouldn't say trivial, because, you know, there could be a kid in the school who's been picked on, to compare that to racism, which actually means the belief that one particular segment of society, one kind of race, is better than the other, as if those kids were believing, for ex-Murphy, that, you know, because you have those eyes, your race is lower than my race. So that comparison is a,
like I'll give you, for example, Sheikh, like,
yeah.
and I would also like both of you to touch on personal examples, so show the reality, because sometimes that hits people, I think, more deeply. When we're talking about the personal experience, like, for example, myself growing up, my skin color was called out by fellow classmates, by teachers, okay, by people I worked with. Okay. And then as I got older, because of all the different global wars that were occurring and Islamophobia became, more prevalent in the minds of people, then I've had very, hard experiences. It's not something that I had an easy time with in terms of dealing with Islamophobia, talking about my religion, talking about my identity, so things that are very, very close and innate to me, right? So I was called that from a young age. Actually, I grew up in a smaller town, and because they were so ignorant. And I want you to think about this. They didn't even call me the right racial epithet. Some of them would call me the N-word because there was no other black people. I was like the darkest skin, and I'm like, okay, if you're gonna be ignorant, at least be an educated ignorant, But Sheikh, like, go ahead, continue. Like, you can't compare.
You and I have been in this conversation. The examples are numerous
because they were so ignorant.
There are plethora of them to give to you.
Yeah.
But I just want to validate what you said, and also what Dr. Quick said, because actually there are documents that have come out that we have seen in Nova Scotia that black people were sold in the markets here in Canada. So it is no more like they came in as domestic slaves. They were sold. Actually, the auction would be announced ahead of time in the newspapers. This Friday, there is going to be this and this. My merchandise is coming. There's this person, this woman. She looks like this, and so on and so forth, and describing them the way you will describe a bicycle when you're selling it on Kijiji. Right. So it existed here, real slavery and selling of people for money. And if you come to Nova Scotia, and I know you came here, you met some of my friends, Dr. Quick, Brother Will, and anyway. So if you come here, what you mentioned also was the black people were brought in here when they joined the war, and the British promised them that if we win, you'll come down, we'll give you a place to live, and we'll give you land, and we'll give you 100 acres. Every white person got their promises fulfilled, and the black people were given 10 acres, and in the places that were rocky, where nothing grew, and those communities are still established. And the communities that were closer to the city, that were not that far, they used them as dumps. So up till the 1960s, those places were dumps. And when they wanted that place, they went again and uprooted them, built bridges, and moved them into concentration places where they still live, which is the black neighborhoods. So it does exist. My first experience with racism in this country was a social experience, because I started going to the Staples, which was closer to the neighborhood where I lived, which is the black neighborhood. I found that, and up till today, I was at Staples today. That Staples is the only Staples in Nova Scotia that I have seen that has a security guard. Up till today, I was at another Staples that doesn't have. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was at that Staples. If it's not in the past 3 weeks, that security guard is still there. And I've been here for about 20 years. The only Staples in town. And it's just by coincidence.
I've never seen a Staples with a security guard.
This is a coincidence. They just happened to be unlucky. It happened to be in the black neighborhood, right? Yeah. And just last year in 2019, some of our brothers here did from Dalhousie University and the black community did the research, and they found that black people were 6 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white people, to be stopped and frisked or questioned or asked, right? So a moratorium was put on street checks because of that. And the personal examples are varied. There are so many. I remember one time I called the police. I had an incident with somebody, a group of white folks. It was about a car in their parking lot. and with a friend of mine who lived there. And I said, you know, let's call the police. So we called the police, and the police came. The police came and did not say one word to me. They talked to the other folks, and they told me everything was all right. I said, I just called you. Something happened to me. You didn't even ask me what happened, and how did and one day when they had the conversation with those folks, the white folks, they didn't even, they talked with them in the corner, right? Two policemen that happened, that were there. And subhanallah, another time I was driving in a neighborhood looking for an address. And this is a place that has garages, car dealerships. It's not a neighborhood where many people lived. But somebody called the police on me, and guess who came? The same police guy, one of the two policemen that were in that incident, and came to me and stopped me while I was leaving, and asked me, "Do you know why I stopped you?" I said, "I have no idea." And after taking my documents, he came to me and said, somebody called us and said, you are driving slowly in the neighborhood. I said, I was looking for an address. I don't think I
got stopped for driving too slow?
Driving too slow, right? Yeah, because I think I should be speeding. While looking for an address. And so driving too slow in Halifax, that was really telling. And the stories in the workplace, at Tim Hortons, at the Canadian Tire, and the bank, they just keep repeating themselves. So systemic racism is everywhere. If you look at the school curricula, for example, the history that is taught is all taught. It's white history that's taught, and even when Aboriginal or Black history or other people's history are taught, it is taught from the perspective of the white person as well. So they don't even hear our voices. So, and that is right into the system, right? So decision-making processes and so on. So to say systemic racism does not exist, it's like closing your eyes and walking on the highway, you know.
So what would you say, I have a question for you, Sheikh. What would you say when you're quoting that statistic that, you know, Black people are 6 times more likely to be stopped? There is an argument that is made by certain types of people who say, well, they're just stopping anyone who's committing a crime, so these people must be committing more crimes. What would your response be to that?
Well, first of all, it wasn't about crime. It's just being stopped and frisked and charged and checked. So it's not this is not people who go to court. This is just police stopping people on the road and checking them, right? So that argument bears no merit whatsoever. Right?
Well,
secondly,
if their argument was, like, so for example, say is disproportionately you have First Nations. So let me pose this to Dr. Quick. So First Nations, compared to their representation in the population, they're far more rate of incarceration than as compared to their total population. So how would you respond to say, oh, maybe they're just more prone to criminality? So what would your response be to that? So that is a true statistic. There are more First Nations. We look at it, obviously we're looking at it as a point of systemic racism, but then perhaps a counter argument may be that, oh, it's just because they're more prone to criminality and so they're deserving of those incarceration rates. What would your response be to that, Dr. Quick?
Right. Similarly to the fact that they would say, like, the rate of alcoholism, drug addiction is higher. But what I say again, you gotta look back. What is the reason why they are alcoholics? Well, what is the history behind it? And the fact is, that the settler population here, because remember, Canada was originally just Upper and Lower Canada. You can only go back 150 years. It was just a small little territory. Most of this country was, controlled by the First Nations people. And so they had to literally push the people out of their lands and then make so-called treaties with them, take over the land. And then in order to certify this, they set up the residential schools where there's a type of brainwashing going on and a type of even, torture and the diet changed and, because they wanted to have a good Indian. They want to have Indian, and like they say, take the Indian out of the Indian. So you just have a shell, right? Looks like a so-called native or a so-called Indian, but you don't have the history, you don't have the culture, you don't have the relationship with the land. And so therefore, yes, alcoholism is there. That is because alcohol was used as a form of subjugation. It was freely put. And I want to give you an example. A Muslim community opened up in Inuvik, which is the Northwest Territories. And I went there a couple of years ago to do dawah, to do outreach and to meet the people and to train the Muslims there how to reach out to the community. And we looked at the situation there, and so we were thinking, how can we give back to the native community, the Gwich'in, Inuvialuit, what we call on the eastern side Inuit? How can we give back to the native community? And so we thought, okay, maybe we can set up an alcoholic anonymous, like a detox center, because the addiction to alcohol is widespread in the community. Okay, when we looked at it, we found that alcohol in the Northwest Territories was cheaper. It was less cost to buy alcohol than it was if you go south to Alberta, into the regular lands of the Canadians. And there was no detox center in the whole of the city. In the whole region, there's no. So therefore, it's easier to get alcohol, which is addictive, and there's no organized way to come out of your addiction. So that is a systemic way of keeping the people down. So simply, when the person's an alcoholic, when they have no chance for education, when they have no chance for upward mobility in life, they will turn to crime. And so therefore, when they turn to crime, they say, you see, these people are criminals. But when you go back to the essence of the system itself, we understand that. The same way with black people. When my wife's family came, my wife's mother came in the 50s from Jamaica. And at that time, there was a wave of Caribbean, West Indian black people coming up, into Canada. And of course, this is different than Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia gives you, the real, history hundreds of years ago. But in Ontario, you see another form of it. And that is that, the main jobs that black people, were allowed to get, it was usually domestic servants. You work in people's houses and you work in the restaurants. And for the men, they were usually porters on trains. So, you have the train system, right? So you have the red cap. So red cap was one of the highest jobs that a black man could have. And they served the trains all over the countries as red cap, which is basically a servant again. So it was the system. You will almost never would see a black person in any political position, or you would see a black person, for instance, on television. Only till recently, you would start to see, a person of color on television. Even in sports, because basketball was invented by Naismith here in Canada and then taken to America. Here in Canada and in the US, there were no black people on the basketball court. Baseball was also white, and it wasn't, only till recently, a few decades ago, that black people even entered into these sports. So the system itself was set up that the people of color would have limited opportunities, and it was usually in a service position or entertainment. Yes, you have black singers, you have black dancers, entertainers, comedians, right? Because this is how the slave system is set up. And they will use you to entertain, they will use you to serve. And it wasn't until the 60s here in Ontario, because I can mainly speak about Ontario, although I've been to other places. The 60s was a rebellion that was going on in the United States and in the Caribbean, and it also came here. And, came up here in the late 60s, 70s, in the time of this rebellion. And we literally demonstrated, we struggled, we went to boards of education, we went to the government, in order to get the rights to be represented and also to have higher levels of employment, education. We had to literally fight for these things because the system was set up in such a way that you can forget about it. you know, one interesting story. My wife was telling me, because we were talking about volunteerism. You know, what is the benefits of being a volunteer? And she said, you know, when I was, you know, coming into my teens and 20s, you know, the main thing I did was volunteer. And she said, now that I look back at it, the reason was because whenever you got a job in a restaurant or a store, they always put you in the back. You can't be in the front of the store. You cannot represent them because the natural racism that's outside, you know, a black person could not represent this restaurant, could not represent this educational institution. And so therefore, she said, I'm not working in the back. So she worked as a volunteer in different organizations, got her education, you know, because of this systemic racism that is there. I'll give you another example. This is in the 90s. I had succeeded, alhamdulillah. I got a master's in African history. This is my passion, you know, and then just by the mercy of Allah, because I knew Arabic and I was into West African Islamic history, I was taken into the PhD program in the University of Toronto. And I had friends in Nigeria, and I traveled all throughout the land of the Hausa. And, you know, I could go to the documents. And so I went to a very high level. You know what happened to me? I went through the system. I received a PhD in the history department of University of Toronto. And I went into the office to give them my thesis, because they take your thesis and they put it in a special place, you know, where all the theses of their graduates, you know, sit. It's an honor. And the secretary was there, and I came in, you know, as a clearly African-American and Muslim. I dress like a Muslim, even if I'm in university, right? So I came there and she said, you got the PhD? I said, yes. And she said, oh my God, you came through the floorboards. What she said. She couldn't hold herself. She said, you came through the floorboards.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, sorry. I didn't mean that. You know what she's saying?
Yeah.
You're not supposed to come through the front door.
Yeah.
A person of African descent, a Muslim too? No, man, you don't be a PhD in history of U of T in the front door. You snuck under the ground through the floorboards, trick your way through, and got your PhD. That is systemic racism.
Yes.
That shows, and up until now, you can go to the statistics. There's some startling statistics coming out of University of Toronto and other universities from the medical schools. And I believe at the University of Toronto, they said of the graduating class in the last few years, only one black person per year graduates as a doctor. This is systemic. And you can say, well, no, you people, no, because you don't get scholarships, or it costs so much money, and your family does menial jobs. It's a type of economic racism. You know, how you are just, you know, by the system, you are put into a lower position. And this is what Afro-Americans are saying when they say, I can't breathe. Because breathing is not just physical. It's economic, it's psychological, it's political. It's all of these aspects. And that same lack of breath is what we are feeling here in Canada. The guy who got his knee on your neck, he's smiling, and, you know, he's a really nice Canuck, you know, but he's his knee in your neck.
No, and I agree with you. I think there's two important points that we should pause to reflect upon. Number one is that the holders of powers in these institutions, so the power brokers, the people who hold these reins of power, their bias has a significant effect on outcomes, whether or not on the surface it looks like all the rules are the same for everyone. I knew a brother who worked in airport security. Now, airport security is supposed to be random checks. It's supposed to be fair and equal for everyone. He said overwhelmingly, the demographic of person who was randomly searched or extensively searched or held aside for questioning was black and Muslim. That he said they had it the worst. Next was any Muslim. So any Muslim that they could identify as being Muslim, they would always, there's no such thing as a random check. He said, I observed this for my entire time working at airport security. And so on the outset, it's supposed to be fair. So similarly, if you have two people committing crimes or being suspicious of committing crimes, one, maybe you target the other person, you may let go, or you're easy with them. There can be a real differential way on how you apply the law or how you look at that individual. And it makes it such an important, like they've done studies where they've shown that a teacher's view of a student, that's why they say there's such bias, it's like self-fulfilling prophecy. A teacher's view of a student has one of the biggest determinants of the outcome of how that student performs. They say this student is a smart student. And that's they've done these studies where they say, okay, I want you to, at the beginning, the first day, you don't know anything about these students. Just rate how likely you think they are to succeed, how likely they are to perform very, very well. And they'll say, okay, this is a smart student, this is a dumb student, this is an average student. And it'll be almost identical, the results that occurred. So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. I've identified these are the people that are smart. These are the people who are intelligent. These are the people who are good students that are playing by the rules, and they're doing things that I feel that are culturally appropriate and so forth. Like there's been a lot of studies that have shown that it makes a difference. Like if you try to impose what you feel as being, say, a white woman's perspective, what is good behavior, that might not be the same for a young boy. You know, that the boys might be like, they say they learn better through activities and things like that. So now this boy who has a lot of energy, he might not be a bad kid, but he's not an intelligent kid. He doesn't have focus. He doesn't, do a lot of these different things. Shaykh Yaffa, I want to get you into this. This systemic racism that we see on the education level, and I know you're involved as well in terms of trying to educate and in the area of counseling and conflict management and all sorts of things. Do you see this perspective being shaped, like this type of perspective, like we are conditioned culturally to have certain outcomes for groups of people? What would you say, Shaykh Yaffa?
Well, definitely. I think you explained it very well. The black kids in school, they get praises when they show good dance moves, for example, and when they throw the basketball and it lands right into the hoop and they score, right? And they are never told you are a good mathematician. So the stereotype starts right from the beginning in the school. And kids, the one that they trust the most is their teachers. Kids can even come home. I remember coming home and arguing with my father because I trusted my teachers. I thought they were the ones that were experts in that field. So the teachers, whatever they tell the children in the school, the children tend to believe that. And that in itself, when it is compounded with the children seeing where they are represented in society, right? Is it in cleaning, for example, or is it in working in frontline and serving people in the stores? That also impacts them. Those things compound themselves and marginalize these children and doesn't give them the opportunity to go forward. So it's definitely is the case. And if we want to fight this, we start from kindergarten, from K all the way to university. Now, in the universities, for example, in Dalhousie University, up till just a couple of years ago, in Dalhousie University's 200 years of history, they had not graduated more than 3 African Nova Scotians from the School of Medicine who had graduated and worked here in over 200 plus years, right? And actually, that was not by coincidence. One reason why they couldn't do that was that for somebody to be in the School of Medicine, you had to have a relative that had been in medicine. So for you to actually come to Halifax, you have to have come to Halifax first when you were born. So pretty much I'm saying you can never come to Halifax. So, and then they say it is not systemic. So the medicine became a white profession. Nursing became a white profession. Every profession that has some kind of prestige or money or bring income, it became a white profession. So they limit the opportunity. So that is how it is really very systemic. And the system is struggling now even to make changes. Because I worked in the health system for close to 11 years as a consultant for diversity and inclusion, working mainly for First Nations people, African Nova Scotians, people with disabilities, and new immigrants. And the changing the system, as soon as you start talking, some people will come with this ridiculous idea of reverse racism, right? So they will say reverse racism. And what they mean by that is the rules are not fair. So you cannot put practices and policies in place that will allow some other people also to gain equal opportunities. So they see that as reverse racism. But my argument was racism means I see myself as better than you. Do these people actually see themselves as better than you? And in the Canadian Human Rights Act, it says that to introduce or to whatever the wording is, but to put in place practices or system or policies that will reverse historic discrimination is not a discrimination in itself. We can't start the race while your feet are in the mud and you have to travel 5 kilometers on the mud, and I'm on the plain field, and we are running, and I do 5 laps, and I come, and when it is time to say, listen, you got to slow down, I say, no, well, it's the same rule. It is not the same rule. We started on the wrong footing. We started on equal footing. So we have to actually reverse that, because what happens if we don't is this racism, this discrimination, it doesn't only hurt, it doesn't only cause anger, it actually makes the body mutate. It causes changes in the body. There was a documentary that was recorded in the United States, and this is really telling. They found that women who migrate from Africa to the United States and give birth to children, their birth weight and their health is as good as any white woman's child or any healthy child. But the women who were born in the United States that have gone through centuries of and generations of discrimination, generally their babies are lighter, are less healthier. And the only variable they could find is these women that came from Africa, which is supposed to be stereotypically poor and have nothing. The only variable is they never went through the extensive and lifelong discrimination that the ones that were born in the United States went through, right? So something has happened to the body of these people, these women, these poor women who grew through racism, fighting it, this microaggression every day, wondering what somebody is going to say about you. But it's even telling than that the children of these African women, the continental African women, their children having gone through racism from childhood, when they give birth to children, their children have the same defect in general as the ones that have gone through historic racism. So for you to say it's not systemic, or for you to say people are just complaining, it's really turning blind eyes into something that is extremely difficult to handle, right? So this outward ban for people to go into law, to go into medicine, and also where they place people in Nova Scotia, for example, where they place the people that came from the United, that they brought in to settle here, and the far places, and then they built the city, and that was a geographic discrimination. The hospitals, all the facilities were in one place. The women used to travel and come to town, and this is about 30 or something kilometers, walk and come to town, leave their families, and spend in houses of white people like a whole week, because they cannot afford to come work and go back. So they come and enslave themselves because they have nothing else, and spend the whole week in the house as domestic servants, and then return during the weekend. and just to reach and see their family and see their children, and after a couple of hours, start the journey again next day to come. You tell me that does not affect someone, that is not systemic. When the system itself dictated that certain people live in certain places, and they have access to certain amenities and certain access and certain privileges, while others live in the outskirts. And if you have a 911 call downtown Halifax or in the Prestons, guess who gets to the hospital first? Guess who is likely to die if it is death, and who's likely to be saved, right? So it is systemic, it is deliberate, and it is killing people, because lifespan of the African Nova Scotians, and I believe African Canadians generally, is about 2 years less than the white people. It is that bad. There is even racism in research. There is even racism in research because the ailments and the sicknesses that the scientists and the researchers choose, it's in itself biased, because they are choosing the things that are more likely to affect white people, and research on it and find the remedy for it. So it is not the process of the research, but it is what motivates the research and where the choices come from. So when I was working with health, for example, I'll give this and I will give the mic. They did a employee pulse survey, so they will see how people are happy, whether people like their job, how people are feeling, and so on and so forth. And when they bring the result, everybody is happy that, oh, the organization is working well. Well, when I, as the consultant for people of marginalized status, ask people, I don't find that. So I suggested that, why don't you put identifiers in the questionnaire so we see who's saying what? When it was done, we found that people who identify as Black, people who identify as new immigrants, people who identify as natives, their level of being happy at work, feeling included at work, having promotion at work, feeling grounded at work was less, right? And why? Because they don't get promotion, they don't get treated the same way by the directors, and some of these biases are really unconscious. But the thing is, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it is still racism, because according to the definition of discrimination, intent holds no value, right? Intent holds no value. So because we have to really deliberately and consciously see what is happening within our society and try to change it. So it's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, Shaykh, I think you make a very important point, and it's a good analogy when you talked about the race. Oftentimes when people deny systemic racism, they're looking at the photo finish at the end of the race. They don't look at the whole race. Like, you started with all these access to education. You had, wealth, generational wealth that was built on the backs of indigenous populations and exploiting, frankly speaking, many, many different types of communities, right? And then you have people, for example, who for generations, like, think about it. If you were taken away from your family, you were traumatized in these residential schools. You were taken away in the 60s. The residential schools only stopped in the 90s. So you're taken away from your family. There was sexual abuse that was also rampant in these schools. Many people died. If you look at the death rate of people who died in residential schools as opposed to the kids in regular school, it's far, far greater in their rates. So you have, like, this history that you've carried, like, if you have addiction, which of course we know the fact that once you have addiction in a household, it's more likely to be generational, that gets passed down. And if we're talking about getting, as the Sheikh mentioned, that they got addicted to alcohol, the Europeans got them addicted to all, these forms of alcohol. That's generational. That's a generational effect on their society. So I think that's what happens. You look at this photo finish at the end, but you don't look at the whole race. Maybe this person started the race like half an hour after you started running. You know, maybe this person had to have chains on their leg while they were running. You know, while this guy was running, somebody was whipping him while he was running. So they just look at the photo finish. Okay, look at this. No, look at this. Is he's deserving of the win. Look at the whole race. Look at the whole system. And I think that's what's important when we try to evaluate systemic racism. So now, what I see in the media and the mass media, and also what we see in terms of a lot of the actions of corporations, a lot of their what you could say their PR moves, is that you see an attempt to try to show that we are trying to overcome racism and intolerance and so forth. So they're going to put a black person on the board, okay, in the boardroom. They're going to put somebody as a spokesperson, you know, maybe an indigenous person as a spokesperson. So there's a lot of oftentimes symbolism and pandering that can happen with the institutional holders of power. Okay. Does this really change the paradigm? Is this really changing the system? Because Donovan Bailey, in that same interview, he mentioned that they'll put a black person in a boardroom, but they've already made the decision that he's not part of the decision-making process. They put, hey, look, we have this black person here in the boardroom. They're going to be part of this process of making decisions, but it's just more symbolic. They don't really hold any power. So how can we, because this system, I think, is designed to uphold the status quo. So how do we, first of all, do you think some of these attempts, like, for example, I've seen, you know, to include certain groups and minorities in certain professional colleges, they need to have like a lower average to get in. And it is problematic because there's a lot of issues that occur afterwards with that. But do you think things like this are the solution to make a difference in overcoming systemic racism? Or do you think that there's more fundamental questions and policy changes that we need to make to overcome this? So it's not just symbolism and pandering and, like, you know, just putting like a different colored face on the poster to show, hey, we're diverse. But in actuality, much of the status quo has remained the same. So Dr. Quick, I would like to get your insight on this first, and then I want to go to Shaykh Yaffa.
Yeah, I'd like to look at this from an Islamic point of view, in the sense that we have the concept of tawbah, which is repentance. That when a person, you know, has done something wrong, the tawbah is a process. There's one thing for a person to say, oh Allah, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me, and then go back to doing the same sin. That's similar to putting a black person in the office, you know, or a native person, you know, in a certain position. But the real tawbah is number one, to recognize that the sin is wrong, and then to truly repent to Allah, and then to make the intention not to return to the sin. And then the ulama say, Radd al-Madalim, that's compensation. You have to compensate the people who suffered under that sin. And then you have to set up systems. You have to do self-analysis in order to prevent that sin from happening again. So this is a whole process. So if you apply that Islamic concept to what is happening, you know, with this systemic racism, number one, the Europeans have to, you know, recognize the fact openly and institutionally that they have been wrong, that they have wronged people. And it's not just to say, oh, I'm sorry. No, it's not just that. To recognize that they were involved in slave trade, they were involved in abuse, and that's here in Canada. In structural racism, they have been involved in it, you know, and then make a strong intention, you know, not to return to it, and then put the funds, you know, the compensation, which means this is reparation. And reparation is not just giving people money, but it is financing the systems to empower the people who have been enslaved and disempowered. So, in other words, you know, in America, when I was young, I was a pretty good student, and I received scholarships to go to university. And I was told that what they were doing is they would look at a black student and a white student, and the test that they were giving had certain vocabularies, in the test. And the white students, because of where they lived in society, they used some of these words in their regular language. They had no technology around them, whereas the black students didn't even come in contact with these words. So therefore, when the test would happen, the black students would get a lower score on the test because the vocabulary they use is different. Their access to technology is different. That had nothing to do with their intelligence or their ability to do well in school. And so the intelligent educators set up a system where they could analyze a black student who got a lower result on the comprehensive examinations, but they look at that person's work in school, they look at their life, they look at their character, and they realize that person is just as good as the white student who scored high on the test. So what that is, there has to be a real serious intention and financing in order to change the system. And the point I'm saying is, this goes really deep. And in the 90s, I was working, there was a liberal government, and we had an anti-racist education program with the Toronto Board of Education. And I was taken on as a consultant for the Toronto Board. We started to analyze stereotypes and distortions in history and in the educational system. And we recognized these stereotypes and this psychological racism goes so deep, goes back a couple hundred years, in order to justify the slavery of black people and keeping them in slavery. Our vocabularies changed. So there has to be a complete overhaul of our vocabularies, our educational system, our history curriculums. I'll just give you one example, not to take too much time. The concept of black and white. This study was done. And because of the study in the 60s, it starts to change. But in the dictionaries before, and some up until now, if you say black, black means not only a member of the Negroid race, that's what they used to say, right? But they say black means dirty, evil, gloomy. So if I was to say today was a Black Thursday, means it's a terrible day, right? So the value placed in the word black, right? So similarly, the word white, the dictionaries before, meant a member of the Caucasoid race. They've taken that out now. But it also, white means innocent, pure, and holy. So in other words, when people say black magic and white magic, white magic is good, black magic is the evil one, right?
Or white collar crime, right? That's like the acceptable crime.
People, I was in Barbados this year in December, and they were talking about they're dreaming of a white Christmas. How can you have a white Christmas in the tropical zone? Because what they meant is holy Christmas, innocent Christmas. You see it? Pure. So therefore, when you say a white person in our literature and in our understanding, that person is innocent until proven guilty. By the very definition, white. When you say a black person, that person's guilty until proven innocent. So we have to have a complete overhaul of our educational system, our vocabularies, in order to really be able to overcome this and not put a band-aid.
Shaykh Yaffa, how do we get over symbolism and pandering and actually get real systemic change?
See, the screen is freezing.
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. It's breaking a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes. I'll repeat my question. I said, how do we get? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I think there is this concept of equality and equity, and equality is a very it's a favored concept in North America, and which means everybody is treated the same, sameness. And that will just make the people who started the race later just stay behind forever. And it will keep them in the second degree, and they will never catch up. So what we need to aim for is equity. Equity means reprimand. It means also putting resources where we had neglected before, so that the places that were dry will also become fertile, and those places will grow. So the analogy that I have for this is you forget the process, you do whatever it takes, and you think about the destination. This is why we have elevators with extra expenses to create them and put them in buildings when we still have stairs. Because we can't tell somebody in the wheelchair, if you can't go through the stairs, tough luck. We will spend money and put it in the elevator so everybody gets to the floor, the same floor, by doing different processes. So you have to discriminate in order to bring people to that equal level of outcome. So we look at the outcome. So that is one thing we need to do. For example, if you want to hire people equitably, you have to stop expecting people who have applied for job in your organization for years and centuries, generations, and they have not been accepted. You expect them to still continue applying. You have to spend extra to go to their communities and actually advertise the job there and show them that you are serious about it. Because people have stopped applying for these jobs because they know they were not accepted. And when you are doing interviews, for example, let there be representation of the person who is coming to the interview around this table. Because if you have been to any interview for any job that is a serious job in this country, you'll find almost all the time white people are the ones who are in the panel, right? And if you have an accent, or you have a language problem, or you have a lingo that's used in certain communities within a certain in culture, like Dr. Quick said, that you are not used to, and you can't relate to that, you'll be looked at as stupid, when actually that may have no bearing on the actual execution of the job, right? And once people come in, we have to get around this union that says the people who started the race early and arrived, now they are protected with the union. Nobody can actually have, you can't have an opportunity to get above them. They always have the first shot. We should look at proportion. So we say, maybe we have 50 jobs this year for managerial positions, union, no union, 20 of them is for people of diverse backgrounds. We're not compromising the standards. We're just telling these people that we are serious. And trust me, you'll find that they're intelligent enough, they have the qualification, and they will come and they will do the job. And I'm saying this out of experience, because when we did this with one organization here and people applied and we did changes, and for the first year, 210 people were hired from diverse communities. This never happened in the history of the health system. Not one single complaint from any of the managers or the directors who hired them to say this person wasn't qualified, right? But we made sure that if the person met the minimum qualification, that they are given the opportunity to go for an interview. And if the interviewer, the manager, refused to interview them, they should fill out a form. And if they interview them and they don't take first position, they take second, and the person who gets first is a white person, give them the job. Because five points for somebody who's working hard, who maybe have a different accent, grew up feeling intimidated, that 5 points is nothing. Maybe they were intimidated at the interview, give them the job, right? And when we did that, we found that people were just flying up, and no complaints, not one single complaint came that these people cannot do the job. So when they say employment equity, for example, people are thinking we're trying to compromise and saying give people what they don't deserve. No, we try actually to give people some equity. We're trying to bring people in who can do the job, but we try not to give the ones who have the privilege to be always getting the opportunity. I mean, above those who are not as privileged. So I'll set this example for you, Shiur. A study was done in Ontario where they took 100 resumes and they took away the names. They duplicated them, and they duplicated the resumes. But one set of the resumes had names like yours and like Muhammad or Ibrahim. So names that are not usually English. Say not John Smith, typical. And then the other set, 100, like John Smith, which will mainly mean somebody from English ancestry, and they sent them out. So 70%, as opposed to 30% of the time, John Smith got the call for the interview when the resume is the same, which means that the problem is not that Muhammad, Ibrahim, and Abdullah don't have qualification. The problem is the unconscious bias that if his name is Abdullah, I don't think he can do the job, right? So, and this was a survey done, and it proved that for us. So we have to really bring this equity into the picture, and this tokenism of having one person be in the front, and that person they stretch that person so much. They're looking for that person for every picture that they want to take, and everywhere there is a speech, they put that person in front. That person works so hard. This is what we do, man. We work so hard, we don't get equal pay, and you stay in your position. Usually, you don't rise up because everybody else was there ahead of you, and they belong to the union, and you can't fly above them. So we have to work from that perspective. And I like the doctor's analogy of the tawbah, which is the repentance, because if you look at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he looked at what qualities you have. So Bilal bin Rabah was the one who stood at the highest pedestal, the highest place on top of the Kaaba, and made the adhan. Usama bin Zayd, the son of a black woman, a 17-year-old general, were big companions of the Prophet, like Abu Bakr and Umar. We are told to come and report to him, right? Because he didn't care what your mother looked like. He didn't care what race who was. He cared about you as a human being. And when you have the qualification, he knew it. And that's a leader. What is happening today? We don't have leaders. We don't have leaders. We have privileged people who are biased consciously and unconsciously. When they are told about it, they deny it, right? And they don't want to take the step and to make the change, right? And that's a big problem that we really need to deal with. I'll mention one thing that really fascinated me in a place that I work, where they actually looked at communities of people that don't usually get education in health, that if you are in there already and you are in a stream and you have some issues like you need babysitting, they will provide you with a scholarship to take care of that so that you can continue education. It is that kind of investment that we need. Then you will see the people come up. I know one person that went through that program who had only finished high school. Now that person is a manager in the organization that they were looking for. And I mentored that person at some point. So people are not stupid. Black people are not stupid. Native people are not stupid. And immigrants are not stupid. It's just we don't have the same level of opportunity. Yeah.
I think one thing that I liked is to bring in the Islamic perspective, and I am reminded of a policy decision made by Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. There was some pasture land that was available for animals to go and graze and eat from. And actually, Umar bin al-Khattab did not allow Abdurrahman ibn Auf's animals to go in there. He let the average person who wasn't as rich. So one thing that I feel is that when you try to equalize or influence the outcome, it's okay, it's going to be even if things are represented demographically and so forth, or we need to increase the number of this demographic. I think you just switch one problem for another. I'll give you an example. Like there are certain clinicians that developed a reputation for not being the best clinicians, and they were the idea was that they were given an easier path to get into this profession, and because of that, you have now maybe those this particular demographic who are clinicians who aren't necessarily the best. So now it gets replaced with another type of stereotype for them. Okay, these aren't the best types of clinicians. And so maybe you're equalizing it on one end, but now they're developing another type of reputation on the other end. But I like the idea of making sure that everybody has a decent starting point. So everyone has that same opportunity, those resources, the peace of mind to be able to, to grow, to be able to achieve certain goals and so forth. So one thing that is going to be very, very difficult and will be an uphill battle is that when you're trying to change the system, there is so much history and so much baggage there. Like there's an incredible amount of baggage, and people are just so resistant because it sometimes just goes into like this visceral part of your body where certain, for example, white people will think, hey, they're coming for everything. They're coming for everything of ours. Like this is the type of fear that some of them feel. Like if you talk to some of them, they think, oh, they're coming for all our jobs. They're coming for all our positions. They want everything, right? That's where you get this whole Sharia law thing. Oh, they're coming to put in Sharia law. Man, we just want to pray in peace, like in our masajid, and do some basic things and just live a peaceful life. But it's like, oh no, they're going to come over and displace everything and have Sharia law. So in our attempt to be part of the system, how can we create a sense of harmony, especially for us Muslims who can set an example, who can perhaps lead the way? Because what I think sets us apart very uniquely is we have a deen that actually legislated. It's the only deen that has ever existed that legislated nations. You were able to have society function based on the core values of that deen, and every single facet of society, whether it's economics, the socio-political landscape, all of these different things, military authority. So how can we set an example to show that this can be done harmoniously? Dr. Quick, I'd like to hear from you.
Okay. I think it's important for us to recognize that, after Tawheed, the oneness of God, and our relationship, to the last Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, one of the most important aspects within Islamic lifestyle is justice, and especially in leadership. And if we are to set an example and to become leaders, as the Quran says, shuhada ala nas, if we are to be witnesses on the people, we have to be just. And that means sometimes we have to actually tell the truth, even if it's against ourselves. And this does not mean that we do not stand for the truth. We have to stand for the truth. And this is not going to be enjoyable for the Europeans, because they have colonized the world. They have killed millions of people. They have done some terrible crimes. But at the same time, crimes have been done by other nations as well in the past. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most merciful. And we have to be able to show that type of justice, which means we start with ourselves. Because Islam is the perfected last revelation. But Muslims are not necessarily perfected. We have a lot of problems. And I was just talking with the Council of Imams last night, and because the Imams are all saying, like, tell us about race, tell us about racism. What's going on in America? Who's George Floyd, man? Like, what happened? So I'm trying to unpack this for the Imams, but I said, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. We don't have institutionalized racism as white supremacy because we don't have an ideology. Our Islam, defeats the white supremacy. However, we have racist behavior. It's part of racism. And we're going to have to come to grips with that. Within our societies, and I'm being straightforward, we have concepts of light and dark. Who was a pretty girl? Who was an ugly girl? What is nice here? What is bad here? Who was intelligent? Who's not intelligent? I mean, we as African-American Muslims coming into masjids sometimes usually when we want a position, they say, okay, brother, call the adhan or do security. Like, these are the two. Don't be an imam. Don't ask to be president of the executive committee. Right? Call the adhan. In South Africa, they say Bilal Bang. This is what they call it, Bilal Bang. So this is a minor form of institutionalized racism, or tribalism, or we could say prejudice. It's not at the same level, but if we can solve that, or if we can change within ourselves, so that our community, when people look at us, they will actually see a community where that prejudice and bias, has been dealt with, or at least, people are coming to grips with it, then this will attract people, and people will trust us. They will trust us because we're just, and we're sincere, and we're honest. I want to give you an example of how this can affect society. I lived in South Africa for 10 years. And in Cape Town, in the Western Cape, the Cape Malays, who came mainly from Indonesia and East Africa, and they were Shafi, and they used to wear a red fez. And the Afrikaners, the Dutch Afrikaner government, who were very much into their Christianity with their institutionalized racism. If there was a court case and a man came in the court to testify and he had a red fez on, that judge would almost 100% accept his testimony, because they knew that Muslims did not lie. They knew that Muslims stood for justice, even though they didn't trust us in some other ways. But when it comes to certain things, they knew that quality about us. So similarly, we have to display these qualities, because that's what Islamophobia tries to break down with the stereotypes that they give about Muslims and Islam. They want to break it down, but we have to actually be living examples of this when we go out amongst the people, and we got to fight the bias and the prejudice that's within ourselves. This is not an easy job, but we got to be honest, and we have to come to grips with it.
I really appreciate what you said, because it's different sometimes than the activist woke type of mentality where it's just to blame. You know what I mean? It's like, it's the other. It's like, they're the bane of all our problems, the bane of our existence. But what you said, I feel it's like some very sage wisdom that people need to pay attention to. That the one that you have the most control in terms of actions, the one action that you can change immediately is your own. So you do deal with people who have racist attitude. You have systemic racism. You may not be able to change that overnight, and it may take time, and it's a battle of attrition. But you have control over your own character. You have control over what you say, what you do, how you feel, how you think about things. And that can have a dramatic impact. I've seen people who were just ignorant, just boneheaded, but then they interacted with somebody that just completely destroyed their entire racist paradigm just by that one-on-one type of interaction. So for us to take responsibility and show, I think, that moral consistency within our own community. Hey, if we're telling the world that we need to end racism and we need to bring justice, we need to start that with our own communities at home. I really like those advices. Shaykh Yaffa, similarly with you, how can the Islamic perspective, how can the Islamic guidance give us harmony through this period of us trying to get justice in this systemically, when you have people who will be resistant, and you could have, for example, you could at this point, and many people are talking about this. It's like, what is the hot button activist issue for the day? And so right now, because of what's happening in the United States, it's focusing on this is BLM, Black Lives Matter, all the oppression that's occurred to Black people, but tomorrow it might switch to something else, right? It just goes, it's like this, injustice or these oppression Olympics, like who's being oppressed next, and that's the one that we're going to give. But why? And then you'll come back to it. We'll come back to Black. Oh yeah, remember they're still being oppressed, and we'll come back to it. So what is the difference? How can Islam really show our teachings? How can it show a better way, a more harmonious way, a way that will last? So something that's not just going to be a short-term solution.
SubhanAllah, that's a very important question, and I'm happy Dr. Quick said those words, because that's the beginning. A lot needs to be done. One thing we can do is to practice our deen properly, and bring proper tarbiyah in our homes, proper etiquette of Islam in our homes. I've lived in Southeast Asia a little bit, and in Europe, and in the Arab world, and West Africa, of course, where I come from, and here. And mostly I've lived with Muslims, and like we all know, it exists in homes, it exists in the lingo of the people. I think after the first and second generation after the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, racism got reintroduced in the Muslim community. You find it even in some of the tafsir books when they talk about a black person, how they will go into certain details that are unnecessary. Even when they talk about somebody as Luqman Hakim, they want to talk about the size of his lips, the size of his feet. I don't know who else in the whole Quran who you will want to describe. Right? Why do you need that? Why is that? And then this introduction of Alf Layla wa Layla, the Arabian Nights, which actually it really grounded racism in the Muslim community. Again, if you read it, anytime they talk about black person, there are certain descriptions they give that. So somebody wrote this, and because it's beautiful, it's a chain. So when I was doing languages, the chain where the way they told the story is just beautiful, where you get the Aladdin story and so on and so forth. So it got introduced, and literature also inculcated it. So we have to really dismantle that language. If you live in some of our Muslim worlds and you see how they're describing, you read the literature, even in class, people forget, even as a black person, you're talking to someone, they forget that you're black because it's just a concept now in their head, right? But because they're interacting with you, there is no problem, the trust develops. But the children that they are telling it, those children just, when they see somebody that they don't interact with, what comes to their mind is the images, right? So they grow with that kind of feeling. So we have to really take it out of our lingo. We have to dismantle it and change it. But another thing is also the fear, which you mentioned, Dr. Syed, is we are afraid of each other because we are greedy. And once we have greed for a very long time, you have somebody's right in your hand, in your house, in your bank account. You didn't give your zakat, because anything you earn it on the back of the rich and poor of your community. Somehow. They bought from you, you bought from them, they sold to you, sold to them. They are the people you meet with. When you collect everything and build a fence around yourself, you're building it because you know you've collected too much. And in Islam, we have collecting too much. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that when you collect, there is the right of the poor there, which is called zakah, which you have to give. And when you give, if everybody gives their zakah, people will not be downtrodden. And when people are not downtrodden, they're not angry. And when you know the other person is not angry at you, you don't have fear. And fear it separates us. And fear comes out of greed. And greed can be fought with generosity. And one form of generosity that is being part of our religion is the zakah. So I think if Muslims can pay their zakah and really put it where it's supposed to be, we can solve part of that problem and the interaction you mentioned as well. I was reflecting on this today, and I thought racism will not end until we end it. Right? It will not end by our value system. It will only end by us practicing the values. We can talk about our religious teachings, stories of our great saints, and our democratic ideals all night long. But if we don't do our part to make our own changes, our nights will only get longer.
True.
No, Jazakallah khair. And you know, I want people to understand the effect of racism has a face, and there are real stories and there's real pain behind it. On the same token, there is the what I would, generally speaking, you may call it the human spirit, but for us as Muslims, I would say the power of Iman, of how Iman can overcome such ignorance. So I would just like each of you to share an experience, maybe of a racial experience that there's a real story, a real face of what you endured, and either the same story or something of how Iman was able to help you overcome that ignorance, and maybe, you know, show an example of what we can do. So like a real life type of example of overcoming this type of you know, racial discrimination. So, you know, Dr. Quick, maybe I'll start with you. You know, what is something that a real life story you endured, and then either the same thing or something different about how we can overcome, or Iman has the strength to overcome these things to make a better path for people?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I can say, in terms of when we speak about Iman, in terms of faith, our faith in Islam, but I can also speak about internal courage, in a sense, and it's expressed with our taqwa and our Iman. But when I was younger, you know, I got a scholarship to go to a university in the United States, in Bucknell University, which is in Pennsylvania, in southern Pennsylvania. And that year, out of 30,000 students, there were 5 black students that were taken into the university. Okay, this is 1967.
Subhanallah.
And we came in, and a lot of the students are Southerners, but through in our courage, through persistence, through struggle, we found out later, that the university officials were watching us, and they were afraid. But we turned out to be heroes of the campus, right? Because of and at that time it was something that our parents put inside of us to struggle. It was confidence within ourselves, and for a Muslim, and Muslims are finding themselves in these situations, our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our confidence. We need to understand our history. We need to understand our roots. This can enable the younger generation to overcome, these odds, really that are in front of us, because, for many people, it's a daunting task, that's in front of us. But, Allah Azza wa Jal can say, be and it is, things can change, if we have the consistency and we are close, in our practice, of our Islam.
Shaykh Yaffa, same question for you.
Truly, this is the hardest question, because I don't know which story to tell you, and I don't want to tell a story that will sound very, very hard, and I don't want to trivialize.
I think people, they appreciate a real life face. Like, I went through this thing, and it's real, and there's pain. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you a light one that really bothered me. And I'm not going to tell a heavy one, but a light one that bothered. It happened in the masjid, and my son went and took the microphone and was, kids like that. They see the microphone in the masjid, they want to talk to, and when they hearing their voice echo in the masjid is just pleasing to them. And when this happened, I rushed to get him, and I said he wants to be Mahmoud Khalil al-Husari, because that's my favorite Qari, right? One brother said, no, he wants to be Michael Jackson. I said, no, he wants to be Mahmoud Khalil. He said, no, he's a black guy, he wants to be Michael Jackson. So that really bothered me, that because he's black, he can only be Michael Jackson, even in the masjid. That bothered me a lot, and I have not forgotten it. And it was somebody I respected. He thought it was a joke. But I argued back. I said, no, you want to be Mahmoud? No, he said, no. So yeah, and this is a light story, trust me. This is the light one. And I'll give you one that happened to me in the bank not very long ago. I've earned the bank's respect since then, and they have earned my respect. It happened a couple of months ago. I came from work and I lined up. I wanted to do something. There was a white woman in front of me, and a black man ahead of her, and a white man behind me. So 4 of us. And sometimes when you line up and the line is long, the folks in the bank who don't who are not sitting behind the counter can come and say, if you have anything that is not cash transaction, come here, I could help you. So skip the black guy, came to the white woman, talked to her, and then skipped me and went to the white man, who was not even lining up, was looking at the television. So I said, but what about us? So, and I made it at the pitch that folks will hear. I said, what happened? I said, the black guy ahead didn't get attention, like I didn't get attention, but the one ahead of me and the one behind me got attention. And then I did my transaction with a smile, really, with a smile, because I knew that was not the place to cause anything or to make any problems. But I said it so that the ones that are working there would hear me, and I walked out. And not long after that, the manager came after me when I was entering to my car. And luckily for me, I left my son inside, because what bothers me is when these things happen in front of children. But I think I'm fooling myself, because they are growing up here, they're going to face it. And I know they already have their stories. So they came and called me, and I went to the manager's office, and he said, I heard that such and such happened. I said, yeah. I said, it's not a big deal. Because they know me there, they know my name and so on, and I didn't want to put up anything. And we have had respect among ourselves for a long time. And he really apologized to me. So I said, no, you deal with it. And this is my area, actually. If you want help, I could provide some help. So I went into the car, and by the time I arrived home, my phone rang, a number that I didn't know. So the lady herself called and apologized. Now, when I show up in the bank, I'm a celebrity.
Yeah. You know what I find beautiful is that both of you do not let, and I see this with other people as well, you don't let some of these ill effects of racism define you. You don't define yourself as a survivor, as a victim, but what I see is community leaders in front of me. You understand what I'm saying? Because sometimes what happens is that the scar that's left behind by enduring some of these abuses or oppression or unfairness, you have like this chip on your shoulder, which you look at the world in such a negative light. But what I find so beautiful, and I hope people really pay attention to this and make a note of this and become self-reflective upon this, you're not complaining and blaming the world. You're leading. You're looking for solutions. You're trying to set an example. You're talking about self-accountability. You're talking about true leadership, and that's what I believe heroes and leaders do. They overcome the challenges and the different obstacles they face in life, and the greater the obstacle, the greater the hero. Like the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they didn't sit around after the death of our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, oh, we endured this and we endured that, and remember early days of Mecca and just talk about what they endured and all the unfairness. Rather, they showed the world there's a better way. They went to all the different, wherever they could to spread the dawah and show, we're going to help lift you from oppression. We got lifted from oppression. We endured oppression, and we're going to help lift you out of oppression. That's the way of the sunnah of our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's the way to show a better way. That's a healthy way of doing it, because you know what you can do when you get hurt and you're harmed and you're sometimes victimized and you're dealt with unjustly. You can try to perpetrate that on others. You can try to be unjust and unfair to others, because I don't believe the right solution is now say white people are evil and we need to, call them out and cancel culture and attack people and all. I don't think that is, because it's going to be one day you're up and the next day you're down. And it's going to be a cycle of, revenge and tit for tat. And you'll never get to a place where you're standing together. You know what I mean? You'll always be standing against one another. And so I think that's a beautiful example I see in front of me is people who have a world perspective. So not just a Canadian perspective, North American, worldwide, being all over the, different parts of the world, to show how Iman, specifically, how Islam can help you rise above all of this nefarious disease, this evil disease of racism. And we should, I think, look at that and really be self-reflective. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, look at it. How did Islam bring so many different nations and people together? How did, I was talking about Malcolm X because I just love the life of Malcolm X. How did Islam, like Orthodoxy Islam, take him from that state where he was so black nationalist and calling white people the devil to now thinking, hey, we're all brothers. It was Islam that did that. How can it take a racist, somebody who's part of the KKK? How can it take somebody who's part of that type of mentality and bring them to love all different people of the earth? You know, so I think that's an important, you know, analysis and self-reflective question that people, you know, need to make. And I'll just ask both of you if you have any closing comments or pieces of advice. Dr. Quick, I'd like to start with you.
It's important for us to maintain positivity. And when we look at the challenges in front of us, and when we look at our deen and the practices of our deen, we need to reflect on the fact that the Prophet ﷺ would, on some occasions when he sent his companions out, he would tell them, Bashiru wa la tunafiru, yassiru wa la tu'assiru. So he said, give glad tidings. Don't drive people away. Make it easy. Don't make it difficult. So this concept of Bashiru, this optimism, this positivity is crucial for Muslims today, because Allah blessed us with the signs of the last days. So we have actually alamat as-sa'ah to tell us some of the things that are actually coming together now, that will be happening in the world. And so we need to keep that in mind, and that the end goal is to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, and to enter into the next life in a state of Islam. And so if we look at it that way, it can be a win-win situation for us. Even though things seem to be down, ultimately Allah Azza wa Jal has power over all things. And we need to keep this in mind with all these crises in the world.
Shaykh Yaffa.
Jazakallah khair. I think we are all victims, white and black people, we are all victims of Shaytan's kick into all of this. How somebody got to look at another person of the same blood the way we look at each other. And we're all victims of this. And if we deal with it with push and pull, right? Like Muawiyah would say, you stretch it a little bit, but then you soften it. So we can't let it continue, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "La darara wa la dirar." You don't allow injustice to continue. You don't commit injustice either. But we have to know we are all victims, and we are all scared, and the scare has to go. Because for somebody to pump in a little child so many bullets, as if one bullet will not kill, where that is coming from, it's Shaytan and great fear, right? And for you to put your knee on somebody's neck and separate their head through their jugular vein from their shoulder for 9 whole minutes, you must be thinking that person is just as strong as an elephant, that they won't die. So we are so afraid of each other, and but we are just. I had a friend who passed away, rahmatullah alayhi. We studied together. He said, people are easy. You just need to talk to them. You know, as simple as that was, that stayed with me, and that has been close to 25 years since I heard it. So we're all victims of this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adl wal ihsan. Allah commands justice, but He commands justice and ihsan, you know, high moral character, the ultimate moral character, excellent moral character. How do you combine those two things? For me, this is one of the miracles of the Quran, because when we say justice, all we think is punish. But Allah says, wal ihsan. Right? And even if that justice is to somebody who is close to you, say, wa ita'i dhil qurba. And even not wal yatama, right? So even when you take your right back, you have to take it with a level of ihsan, a level of consciousness, and know that the other person who is doing what they're doing, they are also victims. What really touches my heart is when I see, when I saw some police chiefs taking a knee, you know, when the crowd in the United States is saying, we have come for you because we're tired. And they have the power, they have the gun. They said, no, I think we got it. and they took a knee. That really tears my eyes. Right? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because nothing happens without his help, that he helps us through these times, just as he has helped humanity through many, many other times.
Jazakallah khair. I appreciate both of your time, both of your insight. You're great friends for this podcast, great teachers, and inshallah we would love to have you on again. And to our viewers, again, reminder to subscribe to the content. You can like, follow, all those different things. Share it. I think these are important voices that we need to share with the Muslim community, with the Canadian community, to show that there is a different narrative that's more balanced. They talk about balance and nuance. You're not going to get any more balance and nuance like this. People who have lived this reality of enduring racism, but we're coming out with solutions. We're coming out with discussions. We're trying to show that through our own lived life experience and what we have been taught in Islam, it can elevate all of humanity. We want people to be elevated together. We don't want some people to be left behind. We want all of us, to have that photo finish at the end in Jannah, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair once again for everyone. And our next podcast will be Saturday afternoon. So don't forget to tune in. And remember, we live by the Haqq, we die by the Haqq. And just when you think life is stuck, tune in to Life Haqq. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
MashaAllah. Mashallah.